Welcome to the Champion Briefs topic analysis for the Jan-Feb LD resolution. My name is Adam Tomasi. I was one of the brief writers and topic analysts for the evidence packet that Champion Briefs released recently. And I encourage you to check that out because it'll give you an excellent head start on your research and your competition. We've all done a great job voluminously researching all sides of the resolution and looking at a variety of positions, whether counterplans, critiques, or traditional philosophical cases. Because this topic just has so much to it, and LD hasn't had a pure foreign policy topic in a very long time. So this is really exciting for me to learn about and coach, and I really encourage you to check out the Champion Briefs evidence set as you go forward throughout the topic. So the resolution is resolved. The United States ought not provide military aid to authoritarian regimes. So I'm going to kind of talk about some of the mechanics of the resolution in a way that'll help you think about positions and the interactions of those positions with how the resolution is uniquely worded. So I'll just start off by saying right off the bat that the resolution, yes, it says United States and not United States federal government, but the federal government is ultimately the one making decisions about military aid. In terms of what military aid itself is, Anoop Shah for the website Global Issues says that military aid includes both training of foreign militaries. So even though this isn't a topical example, the contingent of American troops that was in Syria was providing training to the Kurdish militias that were fighting ISIS and Assad. And in another context, the Obama administration had also provided training to Ukrainian rebels. The contingent of forces that were in Iraq were providing foreign military training to the Iraqi army for them to be able to take back land that was stolen by ISIS. So we also do this in a variety of other places throughout Africa, for instance, training the Kenyan security forces, and also for a whole host of democracies, too, throughout Europe and Asia. And another component of military aid, which is also called foreign military financing, or FMF in the literature, is credits for foreign militaries to buy weapons or equipment. So technically, this just means that we provide indirect supports that subsidize the purchase of our arms, though I would say that any credible affirmative would have to say that if we ought not provide military aid to an authoritarian regime, that also means that we should not be selling them weapons. I don't think an affirmative could get away with saying, well, we won't subsidize their purchase of our weapons. If they can afford the weapons, they can still buy them, but we're just not going to give them that price support. I think that credible affirmative, again, would still have to just completely cut off all military assistance to an authoritarian regime. Military aid, according to Joshua Keating, can also involve non-lethal aid, such as what the U.S. provided to rebels in Syria in the form of body armor, intelligence support, communications equipment, and medical supplies. So if you can demonstrate that these things are also being provided to an authoritarian regime for their armies, then that can, be part of the conversation as well. But mostly think about, weapons and military infrastructure, kind of helping authoritarian regimes defend themselves or fight their battles, such as U.S. air support for the Saudi war in Yemen, which is creating a humanitarian crisis and is also involving Iranian proxies as well, potentially in the form of Hezbollah or the Houthi rebels that Iran supports, but the Saudis do not. So as that escalates, the U.S. finds itself entangled. And there can certainly be a debate back and forth as to whether or not that is a valid activity for the U.S. to be engaged in. Now to think of authoritarian regime as a construct, it's interesting that an authoritarian regime is different from what the Economist's Democracy Index calls a hybrid regime. So they're very careful with their democracy index, which scales countries on a 0 to 10 scale of how democratic they are, to differentiate between countries that are pure monarchies or dictatorships and countries that do have democratic institutions in form, but they're extremely weak and also grappling with certain lighter forms of authoritarianism. So they acknowledge that it is a complicated situation to explain which countries may be authoritarian or not. And The Economist also has 4 separate categories that they use. based on their scale of over 60 or 70 indicators. They have full democracies, which are highest on the list, including Norway, Sweden, Iceland, Canada, and the UK. And keep in mind that the United States also does provide military aid to democracies. So, for instance, we provide military assistance to the UK as well as Germany. There are also flawed democracies, which includes the US. The US was demoted because of foreign interference in our election, as well as the spread of fake news and declining public confidence in American institutions. Flawed democracies also include countries such as France, Israel, Taiwan, Brazil, and Ghana. There are debates about military assistance to Israel and Taiwan and whether or not that ought to continue. I think that it might be an easier sell for the affirmative to say that Israel could be defined as an authoritarian regime and then make a critical argument, critical with a K, about military sales to them. I think that it's much harder to do that with Taiwan, but I certainly think that it's helpful to think about the military assistance that we do provide to countries that aren't included within the topic as maybe an example of where our efforts could be better served. So, like, we don't have to provide military aid to authoritarian regimes because we provide plenty of it to non-authoritarian regimes who can do a similar job and achieve stability and so on, if you accept the premise that military aid can do that. Next, there are hybrid regimes. As I defined earlier, they include countries such as Ukraine, Kenya, Uganda, Pakistan, and Iraq. So Pakistan and Iraq affirmatives would not be topical, neither would Kenya, even though there is a lot of literature about why we ought not provide assistance to Kenyan security forces because of their human rights abuses. There's always that discussion of how involved we should be in Iraq. And there's been news recently about the Trump administration having frozen a lot of its military aid to Pakistan because of them allegedly harboring terror groups, and also providing conditional aid to Pakistan based upon their ability to achieve counter-terror objectives. I think with hybrid regimes, which also include Turkey, which is also heavily debated in the literature in terms of how close the U.S. should be to their president Erdogan, that you could say that these hybrid regimes are authoritarian enough that they ought to be included in the topic. But I think that your safest examples are going to be in what The Economist defines explicitly as authoritarian regime, because that is, after all, a term of art in the topic. So that includes countries such as Kuwait, where the U.S. has a military base. It includes Egypt, which the U.S. has resumed aid to, even as they've created a military dictatorship. And that may be an example of how conditional aid can be a little dicey, because even as we put conditions on aid requiring that they don't go to human rights abusers, the State Department and the president may waive those conditions because they're unsure if the conditions are even met in the first place or how to measure that. So they'll create a loophole by which military aid can continue. So an affirmative could say that's a problem with trying to limit or curtail military aid, and instead we just ought not provide it, period. Also includes countries such as Djibouti in the Horn of Africa, where the U.S. flies drone missions. It includes Afghanistan, and that's in the news recently because Trump is proposing that all of the troops be removed from Afghanistan, where we've been for over a decade. Then there's Saudi Arabia, which has been the most popular example of military aid to an authoritarian regime in the news recently, because the Senate had passed a non-binding resolution recently, last month I believe, that said that the United States ought to cease its military aid to the Saudi war in Yemen. Whether or not that passes is a larger question. Then it also includes countries such as the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Again, we provide lots of military aid to African countries, and North Korea, as well as Russia and China. Those three we do not provide any military aid to, period. They're considered to be adversaries, and I think that it would be a weird affirmative that said that we ought not provide military aid to North Korea, Russia, and China because they're bad. I think that the resolution does not say that we ought not provide military aid to countries that don't currently get that aid from the United States. I think that's a hard sell, especially because Cambridge Dictionary defines the word provide as to give something that is needed or wanted to someone. So I think that definition implies that the affirmative has to talk about the military aid that we are already providing to authoritarian regimes that need or want that aid. And I don't think it's bad for the affirmative to concede that an authoritarian regime needs our military aid, because you could argue, for instance, that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is so dependent on our military aid for their regime survival that were we to stop providing that military aid, there could be a transition to democracy, and that may be true for a variety of other countries. The negative, of course, can argue that would be highly destabilizing and counterproductive, and we can't really expect who's going to replace those who are already in power, and that may create problems with what some security scholars call failed states. Of course, there's also a lot of criticism of that very failed states discourse, but that's certainly going to come up with these countries that are both authoritarian and also considered unstable, not functioning, etc., based on whatever definition you use for that. So in any case, I think that the economist definition is very useful, even though it seems arbitrary to kind of put countries on a scale where you numerically assess how much of a democracy or not they are, because it does limit the scope of how many countries the affirmative could reasonably talk about in terms of aid decisions. So moving on, based on that definition of provide, I think that there is a negative strategy that could be reasonable based upon that definition of arguing for a conditional aid grant. So as I mentioned before, the United States is providing Pakistan a conditional grant of military aid to fight terrorism. And that's explained in an article by Saurav Sarkar in India's Opinion, which is an opinion website from India, about how the administration likened it to an escrow account, which is a set of funds that are withheld until certain conditions are met. So if Pakistan meets certain standards in fighting terrorism, then they will receive that aid in turn. Of course, this scenario very much angered Pakistan and alienated them. So I think that the affirmative could certainly say that trying to make aid conditional isn't going to be conducive to the country just accepting our bargain and reforming itself, and that instead they're just going to refuse our terms and get aid from elsewhere, such as China or Russia. The affirmative has to grapple with that argument anyway of who do these countries seek assistance from, if at all, if they can't get it from the United States, and whether or not that's a bad thing, whether or not that even happens. But anyway, with the definition of provide, I think that that article I just mentioned suggests that a conditional grant of aid is a provision of aid. So you could say that since the resolution says ought not provide, but by making aid conditional, you are still technically providing aid, even if you're withholding it. And you could argue that that achieves the best of both worlds, because depending upon the conditions you establish, for instance, in Saudi Arabia, affirmative could say, Saudi Arabia is violating human rights. That undermines America's human rights leadership. And in order to not look hypocritical when we critique the human rights practices of countries who we do not support militarily, that we ought to cut off aid to Saudi Arabia. The negative could say, instead, military aid is a tool of leverage and persuasion that we can use to convince countries like Saudi Arabia to actually improve their human rights practices, especially with their security sector, which is an argument made by Andrew Miller and Richard Sokolowski, who argue that countries such as Egypt and Saudi Arabia so desperately want American weapons, and they can't really get comparable ones from China or Russia, that they will be willing to accede to our terms. The negative could say that that improves our human rights leadership because we get the reforms we want while still maintaining an alliance where we provide military aid. So it's not the resolution, it's the opposite, and it solves the affirmative's harms. But then the net benefit, if you will, is that we maintain a strong, robust alliance. Like, for example, by staying committed, quote unquote, to Saudi Arabia, we can counter Iran, we can prevent Saudi Arabia from acquiring its own nuclear weapon if it feels abandoned, and so on. Of course, the affirmative could reply first that the resolution doesn't have any temporal marker or time frame. It doesn't say ought not provide military aid indefinitely. The affirmative could say that the counterplan actually affirms the resolution because it says that we ought not provide military aid right now. And the affirmative could say that in theory, there could be a reason to resume military aid in the future, but right now we ought not provide it, and the negative agrees with that. And that may be a fair interpretation of the resolution, because the negative always has the argument that we just shouldn't end military aid right now, despite the human rights abuses that are going on, if they're making a more pragmatic argument about national security, terrorism, and so on, against the affirmative's arguments about human rights or about why aid is failing. I think the affirmative can also argue that making aid conditional doesn't really work out. As I mentioned with the Egypt example, this is substantiated by an article by Farah Najjar in Al Jazeera talking about how the Obama administration had waived the conditions on military aid under the Leahy Law, which is a law that was named after its proponent, Senator Patrick Leahy from Vermont, who said that America ought not provide any foreign military financing to countries that abuse human rights. Of course, the conditions of that law are so vague that they can be stretched to waive the conditions and excuse certain countries. So the affirmative could say that the only solution really is just that we end our military aid to certain countries entirely. And I mentioned the Leahy Law because I think that it's really useful for the affirmative to look at the history of how America during the Cold War had propped up a variety of authoritarian regimes, including those that have done really terrible things to people, like Pinochet, for instance, in Chile, but also the death squads in El Salvador, and a variety of other places, like how the U.S. supported the dictator in Cuba, Fulgencio Batista, who was overthrown by Fidel Castro, who then became an enemy of the U.S. In Iran, the U.S. had installed the Shah over Mohammad Mossadegh, who was democratically elected but wanted to nationalize the oil fields. So in all these cases, the U.S. made the strategic decision to say that they would rather have a nasty authoritarian regime that's friendly to the United States than a country that could be democratically elected yet communist. And there have been a variety of laws in the aftermath of this kind of Realpolitik, such as the Leahy Law, to say that countries that abuse human rights do not deserve military aid. And I think that history kind of gets at the larger conflict that the resolution asks us to engage with, that I find really interesting, of a supposedly idealistic foreign policy versus a more realist foreign policy. So the affirmative could say that the national security benefits of providing aid to countries like Saudi Arabia or Egypt are actually quite specious, and that American interests don't really benefit much from doing that. And then at the same time, there are intrinsically harmful rights violations taking place by supporting these countries, and it makes the United States complicit, for example, with the humanitarian crisis in Yemen, as people are starving from their homes being bombed and lacking access to food. But then also the negative can reply by suggesting that there are pragmatic reasons to continue military aid to authoritarian regimes, even though they do bad stuff. And we can acknowledge that both things are true. So the negative sometimes will kind of have the ethic of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Other times the negative will say that it's better that we have aid and that we have an alliance so that we can achieve leverage on human rights that we desire. The affirmative, on the other hand, will either be making the pragmatic argument that the U.S. benefits little from having client states that don't really pursue American interests and often take actions that are counterproductive and destabilizing, in addition to making the more value-based argument that the United States should only be assisting democracies who share purportedly the United States' values. And with that question of the United States' values, I want to say one more thing about how to understand the topic. So a regime is technically it's a government, according to Merriam-Webster, typically an authoritarian one, but they also have another definition of regime as a system of thought. I think that the affirmative could argue that the U.S. ought to end military aid to the system of thought that surrounds police militarization, because the 1033 program is where the DoD sells surplus military equipment from former wars that have ended to police departments, which enables them to have armored vehicles, body armor, tear gas, automatic weapons, etc. And it essentially treats communities of color like occupied zones of war. And I think that the affirmative could argue that it's best to end that authoritarian regime or system of militarism in policing that harms Black Americans by ending the 1033 program. I think the core of the topic, though, is about foreign military financing, but there's certainly a way that the affirmative could kind of talk about the resolution in a way that gets to that question of 1033. And conversely, the negative can talk about, in any normal context, how if you end military aid to an authoritarian regime, where does it go? Does it get brought home? Does it get used by the police? Or do we send it to some other country that's just as bad, if not worse, etc.? So with that, I hope you have a great time debating this topic. Again, I'm Adam Tomasi. This was for Champion Briefs. I encourage you to check out our evidence packet and topic analyses that come with it, because we have looked at all potential arguments on the resolution and really nuanced and creative ways to engage all the questions that I had discussed. So with that, Happy New Year and good luck debating.